Whakarongo ake au ki te tangi a te manu, e re runga rawa e. Tui, 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 tui a. Tui a I runga, tui a I raro. Tui a I roto, tui a I waho. Tui, tui, tui a. Kia rongo te pō, kia rongo te ao. Ki hei mauri ora. E te whare e tū nei. Karanga mai, karanga mai, karanga mai. Kei papa tuanuku e takato nei. Tauawhi mai, tauawhi mai, tauawhi mai. Me whakahonore ki te kingi Māori, ia kingi tūheitia potatau te wherowhero te tuawhitu. E noho nei, I runga I te ahurewa tapu, o ngā tupuna ia tōna whaia. Pai mārire ki te kāhui āriki nui tonu, rire, rire, hau, pai mārire. E ngā mate, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Rātou kia rātou, tātou kia tātou. E ngā hau e whā o te motu, nau mai, whiki mai, kake mai. He rā nui tēnei, he kaupapa nui hoki. I would like to acknowledge the kaimahi and the efforts put into this report, and also the participants and whānau who have so generously entrusted their information for the betterment of all New Zealand children. This report shows the struggles that our communities are experiencing, but also the positive circumstances too. Personally, this information has helped my husband and I to decide which school to send our 4-year-old son to, as your research has shown that Māori children that are connected to their culture are happier, and this is a priority for us. E tika ana te kōrero a o tātou tūpuna, mā whero, mā pango, ka oti ai te mahi. Nō reira, ka tii konei, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi Māori e tātou, tātou e. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi Māori e tātou, tātou e. Tēnā tātou.
Kia ora tui. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody. It is fabulous to be here this evening. For those of you here in Auckland and for all our guests online, what a fabulous time to come together and celebrate this milestone in what is a very precious study for New Zealand. I'm growing up in New Zealand longitudinal study, and an exciting time as this is the first time we get to have the children's voices in the work we're doing. I'd like to welcome Dr. Andy Sher, the Chief Executive of Uni Services, who's here with us today, and Professor Robert Scragg, our Head of School Population Health. Wonderful to have you as well. Joining us online is Rob Hodgson, who's our Group General Manager at MSD. So MSD is our funder and our partner in this program, and Rob has been a huge champion for us to build this study and to continue the support from the government, and a very, very active champion. And without MSD we wouldn't be here today, so this is an exciting time for us as well. We're going to be led today by Professor Susan Morton, who is the research leader for this program, and Susan's going to share with us the key insights that this report has. So this is a really big piece of work, and for some of you, you're going to be going on tomorrow to understand the data in more detail. As part of today, we also have some of our theme leads here, or our domain leads, who are the experts along those verticals. This is a massive piece of work, and that expertise is critical to how we really think about what this means for our children as they grow up. So a special gift we've been given by these parents and these children to be able to think about what their future lives could be and to make lives better for children. So for all of those of you online and those of you here today, we're excited about the possibilities. As longitudinal studies get older, they get more valuable. And so what is it that we can shape and help shape to provide a better future for our children? So that is the challenge. We really want to see this platform grow and blossom and help influence. So lots of researchers sitting here, really encourage you to explore this area. So first up, I would like to welcome Elizabeth Fitton-Higgins, who is the Program Manager for MSD, to talk to us about MSD's partners.
Thank you, Tony. Hello, nice to see you all here, and all those who are online as well. Nice to see you as well. Cool. Before I start, I just wanted to pass on apologies from Rob. Rob is online, obviously, but unfortunately he's unwell, so he couldn't be here in person, even though he really wanted to be here. And he specifically asked me to thank the team so much for all the hard work that they've been doing. It's been really appreciated. We had a launch event in Wellington as well, which was fantastic. So we had a lot of policy agencies be there as well. And it's wonderful to see a lot of the research community now attend here. So thank you so much for that. So I'm thrilled to be here at the Auckland launch. And it is really lovely that so many people signed up to hear about this great study. I think it speaks to the importance of this study and the fact that we all collectively want children in New Zealand to have the best start in life and to be able to grow up in a fantastic place and to have the support that they need around them. Growing up in New Zealand is a real taonga. It is a treasure for us all, and it should be valued by the country and used as far and wide as possible. It is our country's largest contemporary longitudinal study, and it offers some real unique insights into the lives of Kiwi children and how they are doing. These are really powerful insights, and especially because it's a longitudinal nature of the study, it doesn't just help us understand how children are doing now, but it actually tells us something about their pathways and provides us some evidence about what helps support their resilience and their general development going forward into the future as well. So this Now We Are Age report, which we're hearing about today, is really valuable, not just for the research purposes that it serves, but also in the way that it aims to inform policy, and that obviously from an MSc perspective is where we're really interested. So we want the policies to be shaped, but we also want to not just inform policy, we also want to make the service delivery for children much, much better than it is at the moment. So this is why the government is investing in this study, because it recognises its value, and it also recognises that we can learn so much from the family and the children, and from their stories and their experiences. The insights from the study that have been gathered so far have informed lots of different policy issues. So we've had fantastic insights in things like paid parental leave, immunisation, poverty, material hardship in this country, housing, residential mobility, which has huge impacts on children. And these are all issues which are really, really important to New Zealand as a whole. We're really excited as well about the potential for growing up in New Zealand data to be used more broadly within government agencies, and wider research community, not just in New Zealand but also internationally, and that's something that we really want to encourage and see happen more. There is such a wealth of information here, and we just really want to see as much take-up of the information as possible. Finally, we want to continue to empower the voices of children and families that take part in the study. And I'm so excited, as Susan will take us through the findings of the report. So we will learn about the voices of the children, to understand them better, their lives, what's going well for them, what could be improved, and really understand what can help them thrive in the long run. So thank you so much for all that.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And for all of you here, these partnerships in today's world are critical. How we come together to collaborate, to build platforms that allow us to actually shape our future. And it's together that we're so much stronger. So I'd like to also introduce you now to the Uni Services CEO, Andy Schenk. So Andy Schenk has been a core champion of growing up in New Zealand for his time with us, and it's this longevity and memory that helps us actually continue to shape and grow these programs. So over to you, Andy.
Ina mana, ina hoe wha. Tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai, e kua ana te nākau. Kua te mai koutou. Kei te whakanui I te kaupapa o te rā. Nō reira e aku rangatira. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. As you've already heard, my name is Andy Schenck. I'm the CEO at Auckland Uni Services, and it's my pleasure to add my voice to welcome you to this launch of the Now We Are 8 report from Growing Up in New Zealand. I particularly wish to welcome our colleagues from Ministry of Social Development, who are our long-term partners and supporters in this work. Along with many others, MSD have provided financial and non-financial support over the life of the study, and we thank you, Elizabeth, for your words today. At its heart, the Growing Up in New Zealand study is a window into the stories and personal journeys of thousands of young people and their families in New Zealand today. They share with us their growth and development, their accomplishments and their milestones, as well as their challenges and the things that are hard for them. It's with a profound sense of humility that we listen to those stories and seek to understand the journeys, and we receive, safeguard, and learn from everything they share with us. And share they have. In the roughly 10 years of the study, more than 80 million pieces of data have been collected by the study, a phenomenal effort. No wonder sometimes the team feels a bit pushed and a bit tired. That data leads to insights that both government and civil society can use to first understand and then act on, with the aim of changing the future for individuals, families, and as we've heard, for communities right across Aotearoa. Now we are 8. As the children grow and develop, we increasingly hear their individual voices, in addition to those of the family members around them. This perspective will only continue to grow as the children grow. And they will go from here to moving into school and into an ever-expanding world that they live in and then share with us. So it's a very exciting time. We can only imagine what their preteen and teen years will lead to and what stories we will hear about that part of their journey. And we look forward to the vital things they have to say to us with keen interest. This afternoon's launch represents the work of many people across Uni Services and the University of Auckland, including researchers led by Professor Susan Morton and the study delivery team led by Annette Johns. I'd like to acknowledge them and thank everyone who has made these past 10 years possible, be it in study design, data collection in the field, statistical analyses, writing, editing, publishing, relationship building with participants, the list continues. Everything that goes into this work is important for the work, and our thanks go to you all. In conclusion, I thought I'd share a brief proverb that resonates strongly with me when I reflect on the meaning of growing up in New Zealand. It's something I first heard several years ago, but it has stuck with me ever since. Matarango ka mohio, matamohio ka marama, matamarama ka mato, matamata ka ora, which I've translated as through listening comes awareness, through awareness comes understanding, through understanding comes knowledge, through knowledge comes well-being. 6,000 young New Zealanders and their families are each on their own journeys. They're on a journey of growing up. And for the rest of us, it's essential to listen and to seek to understand. For some of us to aspire to the knowledge that allows us to act. And that is our responsibility to them. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Andy. So this is a big study. As we've heard from Andy, we walk alongside 6,000 children and their families and their teachers as they're growing up. To really build insight and listen to those voices, we have a unique team of researchers, some of who are here with us today, and it's wonderful to have them, and led by Professor Susan Morton, who's passionate about these children and their families, who has become a recognised leader globally for her work in longitudinal studies. Unfortunately, we've been hit a bit with this funny cold flu that's around, so some of our researchers can't be here today. To keep everybody safe, what we don't want to be is a community cluster. So Susan's going to share some of those insights with you today. And I'd ask you to hold your questions, because we will then have a Q&A time, which Susan will facilitate with a range of the research team that are here and the domain leads that really can drill down into some of the detail. So I'd like to welcome Susan to the stage and to really bring this amazing report to life for us.
Thank you. Kia ora tātou. It's really fabulous to be here. For those of you that are in the room, thank you for joining us today. It is wonderful to have the team here. Very sad that we don't have some of our team here to join us today. We do have a lot of illness going on, and we're very sorry that Rob can't join us in person, but very grateful that he's joining us remotely, as are others. Thank you for the kind words from those of you who have introduced us. It's wonderful to have MSD with us. Thank you, Elizabeth, for stepping in and for your lovely words. It's wonderful to have your support and your agency's support as an ongoing partner in this wonderful mahi. And thank you too to Uni Services, to the words of Andy. Wonderful proverb, Andy, love that. May have to steal it sometime. And thank you, Tony, for your contribution and your kind words as well. And just lovely to have everybody here. Normally we'd be doing a few of us presenting, as we did in Wellington on the 13th, Friday the 13th, but unfortunately I'm the only one still standing. So I'm afraid that it will be me, and I really am super excited, as others have said, about sharing some of the findings from this Now We Are 8 report. It is a huge report. I hope many of you have picked it up on your way in and will go away and devour it. There's much more to be done. It's a beginning, not the end of this process, as the song goes. But what I hope to share with you is some of the insights from the voices of those children and their families about where they're at in middle childhood. So I will take you through some of the findings, and then, as Tony has said, there will be time for questions, and I will be inviting others in the team to join me, so just get ready. So I'm just going to give a really brief overview of this study, because I'm aware that most people are pretty familiar now with growing up in New Zealand. At least I hope you are. So I'm not going to dwell on this greatly. But I think it's probably just important to refresh for the context of what we're hearing about from the children themselves at 8 about this study generally. We've heard there are over 6,000 children and their families in this study, 6,853. All of whom were born in 2009, 2010. We recruited them via their pregnant mothers, and we recruited their mothers' partners, or the dads, at the beginning of the study as well, recognising how important both those parents, if there were two, or even extended families as well, would be for these children's lives and for their development. So that was 10 years or so ago now, so it seems a long time, and the children have now grown up to the point where they are around 10, but this report today celebrates the accumulation of their voices and their stories from when they were 8 to 9 years old. Really importantly for this Growing Up in New Zealand study is that it represents the diversity of our current birth population from 2009 and 10, as well as through the beginning of our millennium. So this study is specifically designed to understand the diversity of our children and our families, and what is shaping wellbeing across that diversity, whether that diversity is the ethnic diversity that we know is the population that we now live in, or whether it is the socioeconomic diversity that is shaping the situations of these children. So basically at the beginning, the study was set up to have the capacity to look at our Māori children. 1 in 4 of the children were expected to identify as Māori by their parents. Of course, they couldn't speak for themselves, when they were in utero, but they can speak now, so we can update you about what they think about their own ethnic identity. 1 in 5 similarly Pacific, 1 in 6 Asian, and around about half always expected to have more than one ethnicity. So it's really exciting, and I hope you'll be excited too to see what the children have told us themselves at 8 about who they think they are, as well as what matters to them. Here's just a little cartoon that we just want to summarise all of the things that we've done. We heard from Andy about the tremendous amount of information that we've now collected from these families and their children from before birth right up until the age of 8. And it is a huge amount of information, a really rich resource, as we've also heard, that can be used to inform strategies to actually ensure that these children are growing up and doing the very best that they can, being the best that they can be. And they can inform many things about the way that we can support their families, as well as how we support their well-being. So there have been many, many ways of collecting information. This was in a pre-COVID world, so most of our connections were face-to-face, and we hope that that will continue in the future, but we're also aware that we want to continue to engage with these children at this rather strange time. And it is kind of unique, actually, to be able to follow a cohort through a period of global change like this. So that is one of the things that we're excited about, both with information we've collected so far and information that we'll be able to collect in the future. We're just going to focus in on the 8-year today. There's so much more that we could do, but I'm just going to give you a summary of some of the things that have stood out to the research team as we've worked through this process. I do just want to start by saying that obviously one of the things about a study like this is not just recruiting the cohort, but also retaining them. So it's all very well to have 6,853 families and children on board, but actually we want to keep them on board as they get older. And so one of the challenges for a team like this has been, how do we do that over time? And up to the preschool period, we had over 90% retention. And the attrition bias in terms of who we were losing was not great. But at 8, actually, we saw that increase. So while we still connected with 81% of the cohort who were eligible, which internationally is still fantastic in middle childhood, it's not good enough for us. So we're working really hard to ensure that when the next data collection wave comes along, we have re-engaged with some of those families that mostly we couldn't find, actually. Not that they'd opted out. Only 282 of the 6,853 have actually opted out formally. But as you'll see later when we talk about mobility, and residential mobility in particular, these families are moving all the time. And when you're only engaging with them every few years, it becomes really difficult to find where they are. So that's what our team are currently working really hard to try and solve that mystery. We've got our domain and theme experts here, most of them, which is wonderful. This is a study that is multidisciplinary. It's designed to understand well-being across multiple domains of influence on children. We're interested in outcomes as well as exposures that sit across all of these different areas. We like to call this our Kite diagram. The domains, which are the vertical bars, represent all of the different areas that we collect information about from the children and their families every time we go out and see those children and their families. And then the horizontal woven bars represent the diversity with the 4 most prominent ethnic groups in our New Zealand population. But of course there are many, many more. And every time we are designing what to collect, including the 8-year, we're very aware of trying to actually understand all of these different influences on the children's well-being and their development over time. So let's focus in on the 8-year, the data wave that has led to this Now We Are 8 report. So as we've heard, the really exciting thing about this report is we got to talk to the children themselves. Their own voices were heard for the first time, rather than just hearing about their own well-being and development from their parents. And this was a hybrid data collection wave. It had different components. If we think about the information we collected at 8, there's as much information at 8 as there was between 0 and 6. So now we are getting more and more information every time we go out to the children and families. So that's been a huge challenge too, just in terms of preparation of that data set, but it's also a huge opportunity in terms of all the things that can be done with that data. So there were a number of different components. Some of them were electronic in terms of mums. Connecting with busy families with 8-year-olds in them is not easy for mums. or dads, although mums in this case were the most prominent parent that we were engaging with. They have busy lives, as do their children, so we made that questionnaire electronic. They also answer questions about their children's wellbeing in a child proxy questionnaire, so again an electronic component. But then in the homes, we actually asked the children to take part in their own questionnaire, so their own direct voices. And that's really exciting, and actually did measurements and checked how they engaged with their mums and their families as well. So that's the interactive task. We again took biological samples. That's been one of the unique things about this study as well, getting children to spit into tubes. Much better at 8 than at 4.5, far less lunch in the tube at 8. So that's been fantastic, wonderful yield of DNA and a really wonderful way to understand with really well characterised environments how the genomic potential of these children is being shaped by the exposures over time. So it's a really exciting part of the study, although we won't be dwelling on that today. We left behind a child time use diary for the children to complete this time. Bit of a challenge. It was a paper version. We'd like to do it electronically in the future. They had to fill in everything they did on 2 days in 15-minute intervals, including what they ate, who they were with, what they were doing, how much they spent, how they enjoyed it or not. We also got them to wear little monitors and take the temperatures of their schools and homes throughout the day. So that work has led to some interesting outcomes as well. So all of those things and more actually have gone into the 8-year data collection. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a summary of some of the things that we've so far been able to get out of that data set and to put into this Now We Are 8 report. And it really is just scratching the surface, but I hope that already you'll see the utility and the breadth and the wonderful information that we can glean from all of these individual stories. Now, what we've done in the report, as well as what I'm going to do now as I just share some of those findings with you, is to try and align our findings with the Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy. That strategy obviously was developed after we developed our 8-year data collection wave, but nevertheless the alignment of what shapes wellbeing of children had a really lovely alignment with our conceptual framework. And because of the need or the desire to make things policy relevant in terms of the way that we collect data and then get that data used, we really thought it was important to try and put these findings from the children themselves alongside that strategy. So you'll see on this slide that I've just tried in the middle to say some of the things that we'll touch on briefly today, but the report itself has so much more, which is in the far column, that you might want to explore afterwards. And on each of the slides, as we present the measures from the children themselves, you'll see a little icon that marries up to some of these outcomes that sit in the strategy so that you can see where those measures fit. And I think one of the things that is important about a study like this is obviously it's child voice, so we're hearing directly about how the children feel about their wellbeing. But we're also able to understand what is working and some strengths-based findings, as well as some of the things that aren't working. So we're going to try and showcase some of that as well. And that's really quite important. So let's get into the results and let's do a quick ticky tour of some of these. This is about the children and this is about their voices. So what I'm going to present to you is pretty much child-centric, child-focused. And the first thing is to come back to that idea about child identity. So we had those ideas about who these children would be from their parents before they were born, but now we ask the children themselves. So one of the things we asked them about is which ethnicity did they identify with? And actually most of the children could tell us, although 14% didn't think about it. And we let them say they didn't think about it. We also let them tell us in their own words who they were. That's why we see Australian sitting there. Not necessarily one of the ways that Stats New Zealand would define a New Zealand European, but nevertheless the children felt it was important to tell us that that's who they were. So those measures that you see there are pretty much all of the responses that we got from children. The don't think about it, the 14%, were largely New Zealand European, according to their mums and dads earlier, but not exclusively. Around 85% in that group had previously been identified as New Zealand European by their parents, but not all. And then we had a wide range, around about a half who could identify that they had one ethnic group, so slightly less than their parents told us in terms of multiple ethnicity. And we've applied this child-centric identity or ethnic identity throughout the whole of the report. So when you see results stratified by ethnicity, it's the child's view of ethnicity, which is actually really important when you're looking at it because it makes comparing with the earlier mums and dads a little bit challenging. Not impossible, but just something to be aware of and something we're really keen to follow over time. How does this evolve over time? Because we expect it will change. We also asked for the ethnic identity about things that supported that in the homes. What happened in the homes that maybe meant that children said they didn't think about it, or that they did think about it. And what we saw was that for really non-European children, or children who identified with non-European ethnic groups, they were much more likely to have regular conversations with their mums or dads or other family members about their culture and ethnicity. So our own New Zealand European children, much less likely to discuss that than these other groups. So a really important part, obviously, of wellbeing is having a strong identity. And it's really nice to see these results coming through for some of our children that in later results we're going to see actually falling behind their peers in some ways. But this is a good thing that is happening for some of those children. The other thing that we looked at are emerging gender identity. So for the first time at 8, we know that likely through adolescence and teenage years this is going to change dramatically, but we really wanted to know how soon did this gender identity kick in. So we asked the children about how they saw themselves, whether they thought they were a boy or a girl or somewhere in between. And around about 14% thought they were somewhere between those two. Around 2% identified as a gender different from their sex at birth. And we had about 3% who really didn't know at 8. So again, it's given us a really good baseline to actually follow up what happens to these children's identity over time. Again, understanding that strong identities are really important for these children's well-being. Now you can see on these slides that there's some little quotes as well. These are the children's own voices. So we've extracted those from a question that we asked them about what's great about being them. What do they love about being me? So there's some nice little quotes there to just illustrate some of these things. And usually they're pretty strengths-based actually. They're positive, which is great. So for the children as well, there's a huge diversity of cultures as well as languages spoken in the home. Nearly 50 languages spoken in the homes of these children. The mums and dads told us there were 95, so slightly less now that they're living in New Zealand. Almost all, 98%, said that they could engage in a conversation in English. But the next most common language for our children was Te Reo Māori. Around about 5% of the total cohort, the parents told us that they could engage in Te Reo Māori conversation. The next most common language spoken by our children was Mandarin. And then you can see that the Hindi and Samoan came close behind that. Within those groups, there were different rates of being able to speak those languages. And when we look, for example, within our Māori cohort of the children who identified as Māori, 20% said that they could hold a conversation in Te Reo Māori. And actually we tested that as well. We had a Te Reo test for the 8-year-olds, the first time it's ever been done with 8-year-olds right across the cohort, not just those who said they could have a conversation in Te Reo Māori, but all of them. And actually there were about 20% who did a really good job on that. And others actually, even those who said they couldn't engage in a Te Reo conversation, got around about 40% on average on this Te Reo test, which probably tells us that in New Zealand society we use more Te Reo than we possibly think we do, and that maybe that treasure of a language is starting to be revitalised in this generation. We really hope that's the case. Look, as well as the children, obviously a key important environment for them is their household. It's the people who are around them, the people they're living with, the people who are influencing their everyday well-being, their everyday development, the things they take part in, the choices that they're able to make or not make about what their children are able to engage in. So household structure and understanding who's in the home of these children over time has been an incredibly important thing as we've worked through measuring these children's ongoing development. And what we see at 8, and you can see in this slide that we're looking right across from pregnancy through to 8, is that we're starting to see some changes in this sort of way that the households are structured for these 8-year-olds. So we're seeing slightly less children who are growing up in extended family situations. So around about 1 in 6 now, which is down from 1 in 5 just before they started school, and 1 in 4 around the time they were born. But there's differences in that, and that 1 in 3 of our Pacific children are still in that environment, and more of our Māori and Asian children are in extended family situations than our New Zealand European children. So there's still a large number of children who are growing up in this situation. Unfortunately, we're also seeing an increase in sole parenting. So rather than the 3% that we saw when we measured last time, we're now up to around 9% of the children who are growing up with just one parent in the home and no other adults. And that creates challenges, actually, as we'll see shortly, in terms of the support for parenting and the well-being of the parents themselves, and obviously the impact that that then has on their children. So let's see about how we measured that parenting support. So the good thing is, most parents still feel that they are doing a really good job as parents and they feel well supported in their role. 95% tell us that they are usually, if not always, expressing affection for their children. They are demonstrating that their children are loved and valued. Had an interesting conversation with a journalist a couple of weeks ago where he tried to get me to say that that was differential by different groups, which I thought was really sad. But actually the evidence is it's not. Every parent, pretty much, is doing the best they can for their children and expressing this affection for them. Although not as many parents were feeling supported by the systems around them, by their communities and by the supports that were there. And around about 11% of our mums told us that they really didn't feel very supported in their parenting role. That's quite a lot when you think about this as a population study. So over 1 in 10 mums telling us that. And unfortunately for those who were parenting on their own, that was higher, as you can potentially imagine. They felt less supported in their role as a parent, which of course is a primary important role for the well-being of their children. Okay, let's look at some of the things that regularly we're interested in for children of this age. Let's look at screen time, something that always comes up now, something that parents with young children are probably worried about in terms of how on earth are they going to limit screen time, given all the things that we know that hours of screen time is associated with, in terms of behaviour, in terms of well-being, in terms of obesity, in terms of all of the things that are negative out there in the press. So we've measured this over time. And what we can see at 8, compared to the preschool period, is that we've got almost twice as many hours spent on screens for children as they were spending in the preschool period. So this is outside of school, around about 3 hours on average. So 1 hour active, 2 hours passive. So that's on average, although you can see in these graphs, I hope that there's quite a range of screen time. Now, one of the things that we've done alongside that, and we did this at 4.5 and again now, is actually asked about the sort of rules and controls that go along with screen time. Because while hours of screen time are associated with some of the poorer wellbeing outcomes, when you put rules around screen use, you can mitigate that impact. And we wanted to know how that was operating at 8 for these families as well. Because really, these children are digital natives. They're going to be using screens throughout their life. We want to provide evidence that helps parents and empowers them to understand how their children can do that safely. Not just tell them that too much screen time is bad, because that's really not a very easy message to deal with when you're parenting a young child who inevitably is surrounded by screens and tempted by all the things that screens can do. So we asked a lot of questions about how virtually safe they were in this case, and whether they were worried about their own use of screens as well as their parents' concerns around their screen time. So I think probably in a good way, 2/3 of the children had a conversation with their parents, at least, and many with their teachers, about using screens safely. That's a good thing. So there's a lot of discussion going on there about how screens can be a good part of life, as well as how they can potentially, alongside many other things, need to be balanced out for good well-being. But perhaps worryingly, 1 in 4 of the mums had said that they had been really concerned by something their child had seen on the screen, despite all these rules and all of the other things that were going on. And 12% of the children, so 1 in 8, had said they were worried themselves. So that's potentially concerning, and usually that was about inappropriate content in terms of the parents' report, something that they felt was too adult for their children to watch. So that's something that we want to just continue to provide messages back to the families, but also understand what we can do to mitigate that impact. Here's something that we alluded to before in terms of retention of this cohort. I think one of the things that surprised us in the preschool period was how incredibly mobile these families were. So when we think about the physical environment that is provided for the children, we think about their homes as the number one physical environment. But what we see for this generation, this cohort of children, is that 3/4 of them have moved at least once between 0 and 8. Only 1 in 4 haven't experienced one home move, and about half the children have moved twice or more. So this is really ubiquitous. We had wondered whether when the children had entered formal schooling, this might slow down. We thought maybe it's something that's in the preschool years while the family are moving around, trying to maybe get to more stable environments for their children. Perhaps it would slow down, but actually it hasn't. And you can see that 40% of the children have moved again in this last period of time since they were 6 to 8. So that is a huge amount of mobility. And when you think about trying to find these people so you can follow them up every few years, that's really challenging because they're not in the place they were last time and they might have moved 2 or 3 times. And that has real implications for how you provide services and supports for these families. Because if they're geographically based, and you're kind of looking at where they were a year or so ago and then planning what to do next, well, actually they're moving. So how do we support our families and these children in an environment with a generation who are moving so often? So that's something that challenges us, but it's good to know because we can start thinking about what we might do about that. Although when we think about the housing moves, one of the things we hope, I guess, is that children are moving into homes that are safer, that are better suited to support their well-being. And unfortunately, what we continue to see is that the quality of the housing that this cohort are experiencing is really not as good as we would all like it to be, I'm sure. Almost 4 in 10 of the children living in a home that is often described as damp, mouldy and cold, and often in homes where also the children are, or the parents are unable to provide the heating they would like to provide in the colder months. So nearly 40% of this population being exposed to that sort of environment is not a statistic, I don't think, in New Zealand that we are very proud of. And unfortunately, when we look at that, it is much more likely for those who are in rental accommodation, both private and public rental. Not enough of our children in public rentals, only 5 or 6%, around 30 to 40%, depending when we measure it, in private rentals. And it's the rental group who are most likely to be mobile as well. And that's not because they're moving into their own homes. So this is a group of children who are moving around a lot between often poor quality housing, and we are really concerned about the impact that is likely to have on their well-being, both now and longer term. Let's move to something a little bit more uplifting. So 80% of the children tell us they love going to school. That's kind of good, you know, after all of that doom and gloom. So there are 80% report that they love their school. They love going there in the mornings. They want to see their friends. That's mostly what it's about rather than what they're learning. But it's great. You know, most children are enjoying that environment. And let's face it, most of them may be spending a lot of their time in that school environment for a lot more years yet. So that's something that we're actually really pleased to see. And there's a lot of questions that we ask around that school environment. And we're hoping at the next engagement that we can also engage with the schools and the teachers themselves to tell us a little bit more about how the children are doing. We also get information about how many are engaging with special support services in the education system, and we can then look at that alongside their needs and their other wellbeing measures to see if those things are matched or not. So that's something that is a piece of work in progress too. But I guess given the housing mobility, it's no surprise, or perhaps it is, that actually only 20% of our children are moving schools. It's still a lot of children moving schools between 6 and 8, given that 12% of them had moved between 5 and 6. So again, housing mobility is one thing, but school mobility also creates huge issues in terms of continuity of educational opportunities for these children, particularly because the children who are moving most actually are the ones who probably need the most support and continuity. I mean, you can see in general the reason they are shifting schools is because they're shifting homes. So it is connected, obviously, as you might imagine, and only in a small proportion is that shift a positive choice. It's a choice because the parents want to give their children a better experience at school. So that's the 14% that we see there reported. One of the things that we also asked about in preschool and many times was bullying. We know in New Zealand, unfortunately, that through the teenage years we have horrendous rates of bullying reported by our adolescents. And so with a study like this, we're interested to understand how early these things are starting. And when we asked it in the preschool years, we were really surprised, if not saddened, to find out that 1 in 3 of the mothers said that their children were regularly bullied. And we wondered how much that was about mums maybe having conversations with their children, maybe not necessarily sort of calling bullying what might be called in the education sector, for example. But unfortunately, when we asked the children themselves at 8 in many different ways, without calling it bullying for a start, we found that 35% of them reported regular bullying. And for 14% that was too often, at least weekly, and for 12% of them it was physical bullying, which is really worrying. So this is something that is really embedded, I think, in our culture and is not something that kicks in adolescence. It's something that is tolerated, and we're really concerned about that. We're also concerned because when we ask about the experience of interparental conflict, we're seeing around 10% of our children whose parents report that they are regularly present when there is psychological conflict going on between two parents and the children are there. The physical violence is less, 2 to 3%, still too much, but it's been constant throughout the preschool period into middle childhood. So I think we need to really ask ourselves, what are we tolerating that is allowing these figures to actually be showing up at 8, which I think is pretty horrendous when we think about where these children are going, and leads us to have lots of conversations about what we can do about this. Perhaps something we can do is we can support those children who are doing something about it themselves. And this was a really lovely finding, that despite some of those children who are experiencing the most bullying, because our Pacific children experience bullying more than Māori, more than Asian, and then New Zealand European the least. So 22% of our Pacific children are saying they are experiencing being bullied regularly. But when we look at who helps those people who are being bullied, who helps their peers, we see that our Māori and Pacific children are much more likely to be the helpers. They're there trying to support their peers. So there's hope there that maybe we can grow that support and actually diminish the impact that this is likely to have on wellbeing over time. Okay, so the last little bit is to talk about something that is really important in the policy space, and that is poverty. So one of the things that we've been able to do with these children is to measure the sort of environments that they are experiencing right across their journey through life, from utero, to this case, up to middle childhood. So we've measured it in a number of ways, and it's one of the great advantages, I think, in a study like this where you're directly asking the families. You can ask about some of the proxies that are usually used to measure poverty, like income, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but we can also ask about some of the other things that might be a bit more direct measures of what's going on in the family homes. So when we look at income, for a start, because that's kind of the way that we often think about these things, we can see that overall the income of the households that these children are growing up in has increased over time. That's what this slide is telling us. And so around about 50% of the children are living in households that have an annual income of 100K or more, and that's gross. So one of the things that we are not able to do so much is understand what happens after tax and household expenses comes out. Most of the families find that really hard to tell us. So we actually ask them to just give us their annual income, and that's something that we can compare over time. So we are seeing for these children that income is going up. And alongside that, that's probably because 80% of their mums are now back in the workforce. And that's much more than we saw in the preschool period. So many of these households have at least 2 incomes now. Not all, but many do. But unfortunately, at the other end of the scale, we see around 50% of those in the greatest deprivation area who are still trying to manage on less than 30k per annum in a household, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about how much it costs to have one child, let alone to support a whole family. So what we tried to do with this was to say, well, we actually know who's in that family, so rather than just looking at the household income, let's try and work out how much is available for that child or per person in the household. So we've used a kind of a crude proxy for equivalised household income. We don't have the after tax or the after expenses amount, but we do have that total amount and we can rank across the cohort. So that's what we've done. And we've adjusted in the same way that the OECD does for the number of people in the house and the age of those people. And you can see here on this slide the sort of distribution of the equivalised income in these families. And we've got that there according to the deprivation area. And I think the thing about that is that deprivation area is quite often used as a proxy for poverty or for exposure to adversity. But you can see that within different deprivation areas, you get a real range of individual level equivalised income or financial resources that are available to those families. And that's what we were able to show in this slide. Obviously, the higher the deprivation, the greater, or the greater the need really, the lower the amount that is available per family. And unfortunately for over half of our Pacific families, they are dealing with an equivalised household income of less than 20k per year. So that's 56% of our Pacific children. So that's too many. As well as just looking at income and trying to make up some equivalised income figure so that we can compare ourselves to some of the other routine stats, we can also look at hardship. So this is the DEP 17 scale. We can look at the number of times that a family, or a child in this case, experiences not being able to access what we might call daily necessities of life. So hardship defined as experiencing 6 or more of these 17, and severe hardship is experiencing 9 or more of these things. When you look at them, they're slightly odd in that some look positive and some look negative. But when they're added up, then we can work out what's going on. And actually, overall, we see 10% of our children who are experiencing hardship, as in 6 or more of these, and 4% who are experiencing severe hardship, so not able to provide 9 or more of these basics that we consider necessary for children and for families. I think perhaps the most worrying number, if you want to look at one of those on there, is the number of families who have put off going to the dentist. 28%. Probably I should be in there too. So it's a real issue when we think about things like oral health and all of the implications for good oral health for our children in their preschool years, but also as they move through into adolescence. So that is pretty high. And again, when we look at that hardship and we look at it according to the total household income, again, we see these things are telling us slightly different things about the capacity at the individual level to support the child, but there's a lot of correlation there. Those families that are dealing with the least available financial resource are also more likely to be experiencing both hardship and severe hardship. But it's not limited to those households. We see this hardship being spread across families when even their income might suggest to us that they're doing okay. So on its own, income is great, but when we can add these other things in, we can get a much richer view of the type of resources that are available and the type of environment that these children are experiencing, and potentially how we can maybe help out and support better. While 10% of the children are in this hardship category, unfortunately it's 1 in 5 of our Māori and it's 1 in 4 of our Pacific. So when we start to see some of the wellbeing figures for these children and we look back at some of these measures of financial resource, of poverty, of hardship, you know, these things are all clustering and existing across time, and we start to understand maybe why we see these gaps emerging in our children's well-being even at this young age. So I just want to talk for the last couple of slides about the longitudinal picture, because so far I've kind of just given you a snapshot of what's happening at 8, and you'll see a lot more of that in the report. But obviously one of the great things about a longitudinal study is we can understand what's happening over time. And as I talked to you about mobility and a few other things, there's a lot of change that's happening for these children. And we want to understand what either creates stability or not, and how that stability or instability is related to well-being, so that we can then use that to inform policies to improve well-being for all of our children. So this is our double puddle model that we sit behind everything that we do in the study. It's designed to understand the children as the focus of our study, but how the environments around them are changing over time and how they are in dynamic interaction with those environments. So that's the kind of approach that we want to take when we start to think about what's happening over time for these children and what does it mean for their well-being. So I'm just going to share with you a couple of things. We looked at deprivation. This is a really scary slide. Let me try and take you through it, but there are a few of these scary graphics in the report, so I just want to focus on one. They come from genomics or genetics, and they talk about sort of the pathways and the individual sort of exposures that each child in the cohort has experienced over time. And in this case, we're looking at their experience of deprivation between 0 and 8. And every single line represents one child's journey. It represents their journey through deprivation, and we've divided it quite broadly into high, medium and low deprivation areas. So it's not even the 10 or the quintiles, just 3 broad areas of deprivation. You can see the blue is high, medium in the blue, in the darker blue, and then low deprivation in the green. And so each of those lines there represents one child's journey, and the whole picture shows us what's happening right across the cohort. And I hope what you can see is that change is normal, and that children are shifting in and out of this state as well as virtually any other state that we put up there. So change is pretty much the norm for these children. So when we're measuring exposure to disadvantage, or when we're measuring exposure to different environments, actually we need to be aware that this is changing regularly. Now that's useful in that we can then look at what creates that change, because sometimes change can actually mean that well-being is improving, and sometimes it can mean that it's getting worse. So that's something that we do with the data. I guess the thing that was worrying for us is that almost 1 in 3 of the children were experiencing high deprivation, so living in deciles 8 to 10 in terms of area level deprivation right throughout their 0 to 8 years. So almost 1 in 3 experiencing what we might call, in other words, persistent poverty. And what we were trying to work out is what impact had that had on their wellbeing measures at 8. So there are 3 measures that we looked at, and you'll see more about them in the report. We used 2 proxy measures for their mental wellbeing in middle childhood, so we used depression and anxiety scores. So we measured that on our whole cohort. We used validated tools, and what we saw, unfortunately, is that our Māori and Pacific children tended to score worse on those measures of depression and anxiety than our European and Asian and other children. Now, there's a couple of things to say about that. The first thing is, while it's validated as a tool overseas, it hasn't been validated in those populations, so there's some work to do to understand whether that's real or not. Nevertheless, it is ranking these children in the cohort against their peers, and we're still seeing that for these children, they are ranking worse. But we haven't applied cut-offs to that for that reason, because we're not sure how they apply in this situation in middle childhood. But what we can see is that those children are doing worse. They're falling behind their peers on these measures of mental wellbeing in middle childhood. And it is measures, both of those measures, are associated with having been exposed to greater poverty right throughout their early years. So those children who are experiencing that persistent poverty from birth all the way to 8 are more likely already by 8 to have poorer mental well-being than their peers. And unfortunately, because of the way those resource or deprivation measures are distributed, which is not equitably across our population, that tends to mean that our Māori and Pacific children are more likely to be in those groupings and experiencing that poorer well-being already. And then we looked at one measure of physical well-being. In this case, we looked at anthropometry. So we measured the children, we've measured them regularly since they were 2, and we've looked at using the WHO as a measure to look at their BMI. And what we can see when you look over time, unfortunately, is that in this group of children we are seeing overweight and obesity rates increase over time. So we had 14% at 4.5 who were classified in this overweight or obese category. By the time the children were 8, that was up to 34% over 1 and 3. Now again, a bit like the way that we apply the scores for depression and anxiety, there is a cut point in the WHO BMI scores at 5. And so one of the things we really want to know is this real, or is there some artefact in the way that the BMI measures are being applied? Nevertheless, again, in ranking we can see that there's been an increase. Whether it's a 20% increase, we're still not sure. But what we are seeing again is that unfortunately those children who've experienced persistent poverty are the most likely to be in those categories. And not just persistent poverty actually, and the same for mental well-being, but those children who have experienced the most residential instability, the most times to have moved between 0 and 8, are also more likely to have poorer mental and physical well-being scores, according to these proxies at 8. So I guess that's kind of a sad thing to sort of finish off on, and I hope I'll cheer you up in a moment, but it is real. And I think it's important that we see that from these stories and we understand that even at 8, these children are falling behind their peers. The children have experienced disadvantage, really not through any fault of their own, and we are concerned about the widening of that gap that we're seeing from the preschool period to middle childhood. And one of the things we really want to do about that, which we can do with this information, is also find out what works. Because while children who are exposed to this environment are more likely to have poorer well-being, not all of them do. And we've done that work in the preschool period, and it's a really important piece of work to follow on now. What is going to create resilience while we deal with this poverty environment, which is so wicked, so embedded, and it's going to take some time probably to address? What can we do in the meantime to try and support these children and their families as they move through their journey and move into adolescence? So, where do we go from here? We really just scratched the surface. Even what I've presented today has scratched the surface of what's in the report. So I hope you'll delve into it a wee bit more. But even the analyses that we've done so far have just scratched the surface about what's available. There's so much more to be done. There's a lot more to do in terms of digging into each of these different wellbeing outcomes, into each of these different areas, and we're really excited about the opportunity to do that with our MSD partners as well as our other policy partners and with other people who want to come and use the information as well. So many opportunities to use this information and to understand what's going on for these children, and importantly what we can do to support them better, what we can do to support their families. We're really keen, as we have in the past, to potentially not be very good academics and put out policy briefs, because actually that's what we think is really important, to turn this rapidly into timely evidence that can actually lead to informing policies that are designed to improve the wellbeing of our children. So the whole idea, for example, of putting this alongside the wellbeing strategy is to take that to DPMC, to take that to Treasury, other groups who are interested in understanding how we can have metrics that aren't just based on deficit measures and are hearing the voices of the children directly and can enhance some of those other pieces of information. So that's important. We have a data access workshop tomorrow. I think Tony was talking about that before. We're really excited about the opportunity for others to engage in this data sets, or these data sets as well. So Avinash, who's here, and myself will be taking you through all the wonders of the data sets for those of you that have signed up, and those of you that haven't. It will be available as a webinar on our website to follow, but we do encourage you to come along if you can. It is somewhere in this building, but I'm not going to try and remember where it is. Oh yes, it is. It's James Bond. It's 007, that's right. So how could I forget? So it's tomorrow morning. If you haven't already registered, I'm sure you probably can. It's also available on Zoom for those of you who are online. So do come and find out about these data sets and what you can do with them and how you can actually use them yourselves, because they're an amazing resource. And as I said, we're really only just beginning to get all of the valuable information out of these data sets, all the way up to 8 actually. So I hope you'll do that. Oops. I should also just say, as we all stand here, thankfully mask-free and sitting close to each other, that of course the COVID environment has been an interesting pandemic this year, if that's the word for it. It was also an opportunity, as I said at the beginning, with an existing cohort to actually find out the immediate impact on wellbeing of these children during the first lockdown. So we have some information that we're now looking to compare to where they were at 8 and to understand what the immediate impact on the children themselves was in that COVID lockdown, and obviously over time, which is equally if not more important, what impact there is longer term on this cohort, given that we know about their first 8 years of life and what their environments used to be like, as well as really how importantly the family has been impacted. So parental work and their well-being and all of the things that we know have happened for families and adults, and therefore have likely had an impact on their capacity to support their children. So that's something that will be really important to look at going forward. And that is what we're planning for at the moment in terms of engaging with these children next when they're around 11 or 12, hopefully next year, when they're transitioning through a key education transition. And we have the strange intermediate system in New Zealand that not many other places in the world have, and we're really keen to understand how that impacts on their educational journeys. We also really want to follow up these trajectories that we've started measuring and hear the voices again of the children about how they think about themselves, about how they think about their worlds, about what their well-being is like, about how they're connected, actually, not just in a COVID environment, but generally in what is more of a digital environment than something that was more geographically based. So that's an exciting time too, and something that the team are working with our partners on to make sure that that happens. Okay, so that's a rapid run-through of some of the results. There are so many. I hope it's given you an appetite to explore the report, to go to our website to see some of the things that are happening as well with the data sets. We try and celebrate those things there. I hope it's also given you an appetite, as I said, to come and think about engaging with the treasure that is that data set and all those data sets now, so please do take that opportunity. Or talk to us or others about what you could do with this valuable information that is really such a treasure in terms of hearing directly from these children and their families. I mean, I just always want to finish by actually acknowledging those children and their families, because it's a privilege for me to stand here and to talk about the collection of those stories, but actually it's really those families and those children, as we heard earlier, who are sharing their lives with us, telling us about all of those things that are shaping their development. And we're really, really grateful for that relationship that allows us to collect that information and then to turn it into these sort of stories that hopefully can actually enhance their well-being and also the well-being of other children growing up in New Zealand today. And it does take a team. It's not just me. We've got a lot of our wonderful team here, which is fantastic. All of those who helped write this report. So much behind that, all of the data collection, all of the preparation of the data, all of the work that goes into supporting this growing up in New Zealand team. We're a diverse team. We look like a large team in terms of numbers, but actually many of us just have 5% on this. So a lot of people actually put a lot of passion and energy into making sure that this works, and really grateful for every single one of you. And we also want to thank the university and uni services who obviously support this and have supported it throughout, and that's really fantastic. And of course our Ministry of Social Development, who are our key partners, our key funders, but also managing that on behalf of other government agencies, which is a really exciting opportunity actually in terms of taking these stories to the policy table. So really, really important that we acknowledge them and those who are involved in informing what we do. So I just want to end by saying a huge thank you to everybody for your attention in that. I hope we've excited you about what's available. It's a really exciting time for the cohort and for the study, and thanks for listening to us, and we will open up for questions.
Thank you, Susan. A bit of a chance for a little breather while we bring up the rest of our research team. And I'm going to ask Susan to introduce them, so you get to put some names and faces to these people. And then really want to open up both to the floor as well as to those of you online to any questions. And then we'll close out the end and we'll invite you to join us for a chance to interact more informally at the end of this.
Come on up, team. You can start. No? Okay, so we've got our some of our wonderful domain experts here. Some of our team have been a bit shy. We've also got a lot of research fellows, research assistants, many of our wonderful operations team who are also part of the team. But I am going to, do I have to introduce them? Can they introduce themselves? Yeah, I'm going to get you to say who you are because I know who you are. But yeah, no.
Kia ora, ko Claire Wall, toko ingoa. I am the nutrition investigator for Grow Up in New Zealand, and I've been with this fantastic study since its inception. And it is sure a taonga species, or more than a taonga treasure, I should say. We're very privileged to be been involved in for such a long time.
Thank you, Claire. Kia ora. I'm Karen Waldy, School of Psychology here, and I co-lead the psychosocial and cognitive development domain with Liz.
Kia ora tātou katoa. Ko Liz Peterson at home. Yep, I'm Liz. I'm also the co-domain leader of psychosocial domain, and I've also been involved from it right from the beginning as with Karen.
Kia ora, I'm John Finnerty. I co-lead the culture and identity theme/domain with Poliatatoa Ka, and I'm at the Faculty of Education and Social Work, and I support on education with Kane.
Kia ora, I'm Lisa Underwood. I'm co-lead for the Family and Whānau domain with Amy Bird, who unfortunately isn't here today. I'm based in the Faculty of Medical Health Science.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Kane Meisel. I work mainly in education and social work alongside John, Pat Bullen, who's not here at the moment. So I'm the domain lead for the education area.
Kia ora, I'm Haken Like. My background is environmental epidemiology. I serve in the Scone area.
Kia ora koutou, ko Molly tōku ingoa. I am a research assistant and I support the education domain.
Kia ora, I'm Rebecca Evans. I'm working with the Family and Whānau domain and research fellow, and there are other research
Yeah. Hang on to it, that's fine, because we'll answer some questions. So thank you, team. And yeah, there are unfortunately a few of us who haven't come up or aren't here, and I know some of them are online, but Poliatatoa Ka, Takani Kingi, Renee Liang, and Sarah Jane Payne, to name a few, Kate Pritchett, who's in Wellington. So we have a number of others who contribute to these theme and domain experts, and some of our research fellows and associates who are a little shyer. Anyway, thank you all. So question time. Ernest. Yep.
Sure, thank you very much for fantastic work, fantastic presentation. I just had a couple of questions. Now we are 8th group. This data would have been collected in 2017-18. The reason that these years are important, as we all know, is that certain policies maybe come in or go out or change, and the year of the data collection is really important. So that's just one question. And so this predates the Child Poverty Reduction Act coming in, and the Child Wellbeing Strategy itself, and the report of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, all of which one would hope might lead to some change in these statistics, although we're still waiting for the policies that might result in those changes. But I think the Tenancy Act as well, and the tenure that's been changed as well. So there's a lot of things that might potentially. So I think I'm just saying that in thinking about the age of the children, the year of the data collection of the years is really actually very important. The striking, shocking situation of the high degree of residential mobility, and about 1 in 3 children persistent deprivation and poverty, with the consequence effect on all the development and health in every way, is a very disturbing finding, but not a surprise. As you know, I'm part of the Child Poverty Action Group, and also as I'm on the Welfare Expert Advisory Group. So I'm just saying, and perhaps this is a question more for MSD, is like, well, so what do we can do to transform these statistics so for the better? So that's kind of where we must be heading with this kind of studies. So
Yeah.
I don't know how that process works of going from this data to transforming the policies.
Thanks, Anna. So just kicking off, I should have said this was collected between 2017 and 2019. Apologies, that's absolutely the case. I should be in chapter 3, I think. But anyway, that pretty much is really important. As you say, this predates some of the things that have happened since, and obviously that is why it's really important to actually do the next wave to see what's happened, obviously with COVID intervening. So it is really important to actually understand those things, but others may want to add to that. Anyone like to speak to that area?
I think the statistics that we have don't necessarily show some of the more qualitative and some of the deeper understanding that the study can provide when we ask some of the questions about why people are moving and what impact that is having on the children, which we are asking every time. So I think that's the value that we can add in terms of finding out what might need to change to help those families.
Thanks, Lisa. And I think that the what works, as you say, working with agencies to actually not just look at the bad and the mad and the sad, which is what we've kind of done and highlighted that today, but actually a bit like the work we did with Southern Initiative in the preschool years to now look at what shapes resilience. That's the next step in working with agencies to do that, and then use that evidence to actually help inform strategies that might, we hope, improve wellbeing as well, and then measure to see with this study as well as others whether we start to see that. But some of these things are going to take a wee while, I think, as I'm sure you are aware, but that doesn't mean we give up. Okay. Other questions? You've got all the experts here, just ask away. Yeah.
I just have a question around the deprivation and the way you looked at it longitudinally. And does that track similarly with the mobility? Does mobility feed into what's happening with, so children that are moving around more, is their deprivation track quite similar?
Do you mean at an individual level, or do you mean sort of correlated across? Is mobility more associated with one deprivation group, or is it? Or are they? Sorry, I'm not quite sure.
I was thinking more at the individual level. So the one that you look like genomics, basically, at an individual level, if you look at their movement as well, is there an interaction between them?
Yeah, they basically, yeah, I mean, look, they are clustering, so there possibly is an interaction, depending whether we're calling that a statistical interaction or other. They are associated, and children who are likely to be more mobile are those who are exposed to greater deprivation, but it's not. Mobility is a strange sort of measure, of course, because sometimes it can be seen as upward mobility, so mobility with choice, and other times it's mobility with constrained choice and actually having to move. So it's a kind of a complex interrelationship, but it is one of the things that is you've picked out that is really worth exploring more over time to understand how these things actually go alongside each other. And as you can see from that sort of genomics diagram, if we put that up for mobility and many other environments, there are just so many things happening in terms of change for these children that part of the challenge is in trying to work out what is causative, if you like, if we can ever go to that sort of process, or at least what we think is shaping wellbeing. Does anybody else want to, from our scone? Hakan, who mentioned scone, probably nobody knows what that is. He never brings scones. Societal context, neighbourhood and environment is what the scone is, and really grateful to have people in that space. Kate is not here and others, but Hakan, did you want to add anything in? Or no? Okay, anybody else? Oh, thanks, Kane.
I think one of the other aspects is whether we're talking about, you know, in terms of the frequency of move. So if it's just one move in their early life, it's probably not going to be a really concerning thing. And I think, as Susan was saying, you know, the reason for the move is really important, and that's something that we are really focused on. And I think just from the education perspective, we see that with other research as well, that children who move schools once, there's not a lot of difference in terms of the outcomes, but children who move twice or more, you start to see really quite big differences in their subsequent achievement.
Cool. Thank you.
I have one.
Yeah, Andy.
I'm also interested in the genomics slide, and what it made me think about was the frequency of if you like, two-step changes, interval to interval versus adjacencies, and whether there were actually more than one thing that one could conclude from that. And I guess that what it made me think about was how much of it is effectively change shock, and how much of it is incremental, and can you tell?
That's a really good question, and I'm going to hand this one to Liz, because we've kind of looked at this quite a lot when we've thought about self-regulation. So it's kind of that, what's the distance between the movement? Like, is it a proximal change that really probably doesn't have much effect, or is it something that's a shock one way or the other? So do you want to talk about some of the things that we've done with looking at that with self-regulation over time and sort of thinking about movement and flux? Just putting you on the spot, sorry. Yeah.
I think the thing about is that there's movement across everything. I think that's what Susan said when she showed that slide, was we can put that movement measure against everything. And I think it's really important to understand that movement, because often we think we've got a trajectory, but we also have to understand what's normal movement and what's abnormal movement, particularly when it comes to something like development, which I guess is more the domain that we work in, is because different skills and different abilities come online at different times, and what can look like a deficit or slow growth might just be that it's just growing at a different rate, and they get there and we can turn around and try and intervene, but in actual fact there was no point because they were going to get there naturally without doing anything. And it's understanding that natural flux and change across any measure that we take, and trying to unpick what are the reasons for that, and is it normal or is it something to worry about. And I think that's something that we need to start to unpick, the persistent lows versus those that are actually just naturally moving.
Correct.
We've just got a question online here about bullying. Given the high rates of bullying and knowing there are anti-bullying programs in schools, does this mean that teachers tolerate it or don't know how to recognise it and or respond to it?
I'm just going to hand that to my education domain specialist, John and or Kane. Thank you.
Seem to be next to the mic.
Yeah.
And bullying is something I'm very close to. I used to work at NetSafe. I think a huge part of this is that teachers are doing absolutely the best they can do, and it's one of the things we know about bullying is that it is a complex phenomenon. It's not something that is just simple that can be disappeared with a poster campaign or someone saying don't do this. It exists in a socio-cultural environment, both nationally and actually within the school. And there are many levers that we can pull to affect bullying. The fact that bullying exists is not the fault of teachers. It really is something that we need to think about, obviously, at a cultural level around how we understand an other difference and punish people for being outside of the norm, how we valorise competition and we support people to try and be better than other people, right down to the curriculum that we have and how we implement that and how we assess students. So there's so many different layers by which I think we can try and put the blame on bullying, and I wouldn't put it just on teachers, though I would say that teachers definitely need more support to address bullying, and I think the teachers I work with would say the same thing.
Good. Yeah.
How does the Growing Up in New Zealand study compare with other longitudinal studies internationally? Are there any similarities or any patterns that jump out at any of the waves compared with other longitudinal studies?
Yeah, good question. Okay, all right. So we have a family of growing up studies that we engage with. I'm good. You can talk. You just hold on to that. So we do know how we compare. I think one of the things that's quite unique about growing up in New Zealand is the diversity of our population. Many growing up studies, including growing up in Australia, for example, actually exclude ethnic diversity. They are much more monocultural. So they don't have the sort of questions that we have. They don't have a culture and identity domain, for example, which is so fundamental to everything that we do. And we want to understand not just using ethnicity as an explanatory variable, but what it means to identify with different groups. So that's something that sets us apart. Although there are other similarities in that we're following a group of children over time to understand what's shaping their wellbeing. So I think, as Elizabeth was saying earlier, this idea of being able to compare ourselves internationally to other growing up cohorts is incredibly important. We have already done some work called Growing Up Healthy around the globe, where we've looked at how growing up in New Zealand children correspond to growing up in Scotland, growing up in Australia and growing up in Ireland, and looked at what is shaping their SDQ scores actually, which is something that Karen could talk about much more knowledgeably than I'm able to. But interestingly, we see some similarities in terms of what environments shape that, and then we see some policy contexts that are potentially different, and that's what we're interested in, because this is a cohort growing up in the same environment. We heard from Innes before, there are policy contexts that are affecting all of these children at the same time, so we can't dissect so much how that is influencing their well-being, but we can look to other socio-political contexts to try and understand what sort of policies might enable better well-being or potentially act as barriers. So lots of things we can learn that way. Do you want to?
And just briefly, I worked with the Dunedin study, and what is so wonderful about this study is the fact that we looked at mothers and partners in pregnancy. So we don't have to worry about that retrospective recall, that people weren't, rocking up to the hospital after they've given birth and asked, multiple hour questionnaire. We're actually getting that information from mothers and partners during pregnancy, which is so, so important. And also at 9 months and at 2 years. The Dunedin study, we had birth, we had 3 years. We know that the first 1,000 days is so important developmentally, so.
Good. All right, is there one last question? Oh, yep, up the top, thank you. Lucky last.
If you were in a decision-making role, you're the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Housing, all at the time, and you were to propose one, possibly two policies, either amendments to existing policies or new policies, particularly to address the issue of mobility or excess mobility, what would you shine a spotlight on?
Well, luckily I'm not, but and others may have more wisdom than I do. I guess As I reflect on this, and I'm going to give other people a chance to maybe have their say as well, because you can think about it while I make a fool of myself. The one thing I would say is that I think we have to move away from blaming families and children, and we need to be wrapping support around these families and the children right from the beginning. And from the beginning means in pregnancy, not waiting until some of these things happening. So we could do better in our system of care in pregnancy to identify those families that needed more support, and we could wrap that support around them instead of making them go out and seek that support or fall off a cliff before somebody does something about it. So I think there's something about that, and also the continuity that exists between our lead maternity carer system and the well child system, and actually enabling that to be much easier for people to negotiate rather than expecting our most vulnerable to do that on their own. So that would be one thing. Absolutely, the housing is a critical issue. I mean, we see not only mobility but poor quality housing. So the whole idea that it's already started and already has some traction, but doing more of it in terms of ensuring that children actually have warm environments, physical environments to grow up in, and they're not having to move between houses that are damp and cold and not having to move per se, I think is something that is a huge challenge to all of us, and I know that it's something that is currently on the agenda. So there's that. Yeah, those would be two things that jump out. Others may have more wise areas that they would want to do in terms of being a Minister of Finance or Minister of Housing or whatever else, which thankfully we're not. We just hope that this evidence will be used by those people, I suppose.
Claire hasn't said anything yet.
Ah, Claire.
Oh. I suppose mine would be to remove the GST off fruit and vegetables, and also, which the government are currently looking at the process now of rolling out free school meals across the board. And I think that's a really positive step and could address some of the issues that we've seen. You know, not that we've taken a lot of detailed information from the children around the dietary intake at 8, but some of the other issues that we've seen in the other data collection waves as well.
Anybody else like to send a message to the government of the day through Elizabeth or somebody else? It's quite difficult. I guess maybe it's a good way to just sort of wrap up. I guess what we are really hoping is that this collection of voices, which talks about the lived realities of our children and families, can actually be used at that policy table, and that's really what drives all of us, I think, in terms of just making sure that those voices are heard, because there's a lot of anecdote that drives policy. There's a lot of good intent that is behind policy, but what we're trying to do is to make sure that it's actually matching the needs of this generation, and that it is going to improve their well-being, but also improve the well-being of the children who are coming behind them. So I think that's probably the key thing that we really want to see happen with this, rather than perhaps luckily not having to make the policy ourselves, but wanting to provide that evidence and have it used. Yeah.
I want to say one thing.
Thank you, Liz.
One thing I think that will make a difference too is that a lot of the variables that we look at that lead to good outcomes are parenting related outcomes, because that's what we've got the measure from the mother, but it's not and the partner in some cases. But it might be things like spending time with the child or having rules around screen time and all those things, but that's not a manifestation of the home environment. That could well be a manifestation of the fact that the parent just doesn't have time to do those things because they're running these complex, chaotic lives, multiple jobs and things. So I think often we look at, it comes back to looking sometimes at the family environment, but there are other things outside that enable, parents want, 90% of it, they want to be good parents, but sometimes the system doesn't enable them to do it even though they know what's right. So I think that's important too.
Thanks, Liz. So Annette, I'm going to invite you up to bring this to a close, even though we could probably carry on hearing from our experts for a long time, but thank you.
Kia ora, katoa. I'm Annette Johns, the General Manager at Growing Up New Zealand. It's been really wonderful actually to hear all of your voices today. And I want to say first thank you all for your questions. And Susan, as you've said, this report is just the beginning. Today is not only about presenting these findings, but more importantly, it's a starting point, a platform to move forward and explore the many more research opportunities available I would encourage you to get in touch with the Growing Up team to learn more about how you can access and make the most of what this valuable data offers. Appreciate te aonga. On that note, as mentioned earlier, we have a workshop from 9:30 to 11 tomorrow to introduce you to the data collected and the technical supporting documents. It's a great way to familiarise yourself with the available study data and how to best use it. And if you're interested in attending, we actually have some details on the sign-up sheet on the table outside. As we close today, I'd like to express my thanks to our growing up children and their families for so generously sharing their information with us. This is something special to me personally. What is the most important thing in the world? Ngā tamariki, ngā tamariki, ngā tamariki. It is the children. It is the children. It is the children. I would also like to pay tribute to the passion, dedication and hard work of the entire Growing Up New Zealand team. To all of you, these data collection waves are large and complex undertakings and are a testament to our highly skilled multidisciplinary team. To all of you, I sincerely acknowledge and thank you for the years of work that you have gone into producing this report. What an achievement. It is something we can all be proud of. Thank you to Tui, to Tony, Elizabeth and Andy for your contribution to today's event. Thank you to the research panel for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. And lastly, a very special thank you to Susan, not only for today, but your expertise, ongoing passion and commitment to the study. Thank you. Thanks. To celebrate. Thank you again for coming today, and we'd like you to please join us in the atrium upstairs for drinks and nibbles. Time to celebrate.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you. Yeah.